Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has declared that his country will soon be marking 2 victory days. It's a reference to Russia's annual commemoration of the Soviet Union's triumph over Nazi Germany. Now, President Vladimir Putin again likened his invasion of Ukraine to the fight against Nazism as he presided over a military parade. But he was silent on the progress and duration of war.
Russia's annual Victory Day spectacle has taken on a different meaning amid its invasion of Ukraine. Nuclear missiles and heavy armor underscored Moscow's military might, as Russian President Vladimir Putin again insisted his country was forced into defending itself.
В открытую шла подготовка к очередной карательной операции на Донбассе, к вторжению на наши исторические земли, включая Крым. В Киеве заявляли о возможном приобретении ядерного оружия. Блок НАТО начал активное военное освоение прилегающих к нам территорий. Таким образом, планомерно создавалась абсолютно неприемлемая для нас угроза, причем непосредственно у наших границ.
Mr. Putin hailed the soldiers at war in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, saying they're fighting for the motherland. He also acknowledged Russia's losses in the conflict with a minute of silence. But President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says Ukraine will not allow Russia to appropriate Victory Day. He accused Russia of staging a bloody reenactment of Nazism in Ukraine in an unprovoked war of aggression.
І зовсім скоро в Україні буде 2 дні перемоги, а в когось не залишиться жодного. Перемогли тоді, переможемо і зараз. І Хрещатик побачить парад перемоги. Перемоги України.
He warned that the anniversary could bring a renewed onslaught of attacks by Moscow.
Well, this Julia Chapman joins us live from Moscow. Julia, of course, the subject matter for Mr. Putin is different today, as speeches have been in past years. But the general shape of Mr. Putin's speech today, how does it compare to last year's?
Well, it was a little bit shorter, and that comes during a parade that was a little bit shorter. Sorry, the speech was a little bit longer. The parade itself a little bit shorter than in years gone by, but still quite a large spectacle with thousands of troops taking part, thousands of people watching on the streets here in Moscow. There was, of course, less hardware than we've seen in previous years. But as for the nature of the speech itself, given by President Vladimir Putin, speaking on Red Square, addressing his troops and indeed the entire country, he did very much focus on what was going on in Ukraine, the so-called special military operation, as the Kremlin insists that we call it. But he didn't mention the country by name. He insisted that Russia's actions there were necessary and timely. He said they had been provoked by aggression, not only by the authorities in Kiev, but also by the West, accusing NATO of building up forces on Russia's borders, painting a picture whereby Russia was forced to act. This is the message that the Russian government has been sending to its people, and one that many of them indeed are believing and accepting. But certainly it was a fiery speech, although it did not contain any major announcements. There was no mass mobilization, no formal declaration of war, both of which had been rumored to possibly be announced today.
Or Julie, speak of the general belief and support for Mr. Putin's interpretation of what's happening in Ukraine. Did you sense clear public support for this so-called special military operation?
It is incredibly difficult to gauge the level of support for what is happening in Ukraine because, of course, today we're seeing many thousands of Russians, hundreds of thousands, in fact, here on the streets. Right now we're attending the so-called Immortal Regiment, where people carry pictures of their ancestors who died during the Second World War. This is a big annual event. It hasn't been held in the last couple of years because of the pandemic, so we are sensing a pretty jubilant atmosphere here on the streets of Moscow today. But of course, many of them are just celebrating the family that they lost during the war, or those who indeed survived that incredibly difficult period of Soviet history, the Soviet Soviet Union, of course, suffering the greatest losses during World War II. But it is difficult to know how many extend that support to what their government is doing in Ukraine. There are, of course, a few people here on the street that we have seen wearing symbols of the so-called special military operation, wearing a Z on their vests, for example. Russian state media, Russian state pollsters claim that there is wide popular support for Russia's actions, but under the circumstances, it's incredibly hard to know whether those responses to the polls are in fact genuine.
And thanks for that, Julia Chapman speaking to us there from Moscow.